Mark Hollis kissed his wife goodbye before heading to Mirror Lake, and was never seen again. Years later, Tom Pritchard, a drifter with a criminal past, was found dead in Mark's missing truck. And behind it all lurked Paul Renner, a name no one had connected to the case, until a shocking DNA match revealed the brutal truth of what really happened on that fishing trip. Mark Hollis was the kind of man everyone in town knew, not because he was flashy or loud, but because he was dependable. A 42-year-old mechanic in the small Oregon town of Pineview, Mark was known for his easygoing nature, steady work ethic, and devotion to his family. He had been married to Linda for nearly 20 years, and they had 2 children, both in their teens. On weekends, Mark loved nothing more than to head out into the wilderness for some quiet time at Mirror Lake, a peaceful fishing spot tucked away in the mountains. On the morning of October 12, 2013, Mark packed up his old blue pickup truck with his fishing rods, tackle box, cooler, and a thermos of coffee. He gave Linda a kiss on the cheek and promised he'd be back before dark. It was a trip he'd taken countless times, familiar and uneventful. But that evening, when the sun slipped below the horizon and Mark still hadn't returned, Linda's worry began to grow. She called his cell phone, but it went straight to voicemail. She waited another hour, then another, pacing by the window, watching for headlights that never appeared. By midnight, Linda called the local sheriff. A search was launched early the next morning. Friends, neighbors, and local volunteers spread out across the trails near Mirror Lake. Deputies combed the shoreline, divers searched the water, and helicopters swept the area from above. But there was no sign of Mark, no truck parked near the trailhead, no footprints, no dropped gear. It was as if he had never arrived at the lake at all. The first few days of the search were frantic, fueled by hope and adrenaline. Linda refused to believe Mark could just vanish. She knew he was a careful man, not someone who took risks. But as days stretched into weeks, hope began to fade. The local news covered the story heavily at first, interviewing family members and covering the volunteer search efforts. But with no evidence, no clues, and no breakthroughs, attention drifted elsewhere. Linda was left in a painful limbo. She had to explain to her children that their father was gone, but without knowing how or why. Police theorized that maybe Mark had gotten lost or injured on a side trail, or perhaps had fallen into the water where search teams hadn't been able to reach. There were even whispers, never spoken directly to Linda, but murmured quietly, that maybe Mark had left on purpose. Maybe he was overwhelmed by something no one else saw. Linda rejected that idea completely. She knew Mark. He would never abandon his family. In the months that followed, Linda kept Mark's truck payment up, though the truck itself had never been found. She clung to his belongings, keeping them just as he had left them. The house grew, quieter. Friends who had once checked in regularly stopped calling as often. Time moved forward, but Linda and her children were stuck, always wondering what had happened on that fishing trip and why Mark had disappeared without a trace. Months after Mark Hollis disappeared, life in Pineview slowly returned to its usual rhythm, but for Linda and her children, the pain never lifted. What made things worse was the absence of answers. Without a body, without the truck, and without any trace of Mark's final moments, it was impossible to grieve properly. But then, small and strange details began to surface, keeping the wound open. About 5 months after the disappearance, Linda received a call from the sheriff's office. Someone had used Mark's credit card at a gas station nearly 300 miles away in another part of the state. The charge was small, just a tank of gas and a pack of cigarettes, but it set off alarm bells. Investigators pulled security footage from the station, but all they got was a blurry figure, head down, wearing a baseball cap, his face hidden by the camera angle. It wasn't enough to identify anyone, but it was enough to raise uncomfortable questions. Was Mark still alive? Had someone stolen his wallet? Linda clung to the hope that maybe Mark had survived somehow, that maybe he had run from something none of them understood. But as weeks passed with no further activity, the excitement drained away. The police kept the case open but said they had no leads. Then, a year later, a fresh surprise came. Mark's Social Security number was flagged when someone applied for a job in Idaho. Again, when investigators followed the trail, they hit a dead end. The person applying had used false identification, and by the time anyone arrived to question him, he had disappeared. These strange, scattered events only deepened the mystery. Rumors rippled through Pineview. Some people whispered that Mark had wanted to leave, that maybe he was running from debt or an affair. Others speculated about foul play, though no one could say who would have wanted to hurt him. Linda tried to shield her children from the gossip, but the uncertainty wore her down. She still believed Mark would never walk away from his family, but even she had to wonder how his card and Social Security number were showing up in places he had never been. By 2018, 5 years after the disappearance, the case was a shadow of what it once was. The local news no longer reported on it, and the search teams had long since disbanded. Linda's children were older now, moving into their own adult lives, though always under the long shadow of their father's disappearance. Linda herself felt caught between two impossible versions of reality. Either Mark had died out there in the woods, or he had somehow abandoned them, and she wasn't sure which hurt more. The sheriff's office eventually labeled Mark's case inactive, but never officially closed it. His name sat quietly in the National Missing Persons Database, a digital ghost waiting to be matched to a clue that might never come. For Linda, every knock at the door, every unexpected phone call, brought a flicker of hope that was quickly smothered by disappointment. She lived on the edge of unanswered questions, haunted by the smallest chance that the man she loved was out there somewhere, lost not just to her but to himself, but to... It was a blistering summer day in July 2021 when a group of hikers, exploring a remote stretch of forest nearly 200 miles from Mirror Lake, stumbled upon something that made their stomachs drop. Hidden behind dense undergrowth and half-sunken into the earth was an old, rusted-out blue pickup truck. The tires were flat, the windows cracked, and vines had begun creeping up its sides. To the hikers, it looked like the woods were slowly swallowing the vehicle whole. Out of curiosity, they approached, peering through the grimy windows. And that's when they saw it. A human skeleton, slumped over the steering wheel, sun-bleached and partially collapsed, sat motionless inside. They called the police immediately. Within hours, the forest was swarming with investigators, crime scene techs, and news crews eager for details. The truck's plates were quickly traced, and the name that came up sent a chill through the sheriff's department. Mark Hollis. After nearly 8 years, Mark's missing vehicle had been found, but with a body inside that no one expected. When the remains were recovered and dental records checked, the shock deepened. The skeleton in the driver's seat was not Mark Hollis. Instead, the body belonged to Tom Pritchard, a drifter and petty criminal known to law enforcement for small-time thefts and drug charges. Tom had no known connection to Mark, no ties to Pineview, and no clear reason to be in possession of Mark's truck. Inside the vehicle, police recovered Mark's old fishing gear, his wallet, and a blood-stained jacket that had been left untouched for years. The scene raised far more questions than it answered. Why had the truck been abandoned so far from where Mark was last seen? How had Tom Pritchard ended up dead behind the wheel? And most troubling of all, where was Mark Hollis? The discovery reignited public interest in the case. News reports ran headlines about the bizarre twist, speculating wildly about what might have happened. Some imagined that Mark had been carjacked. Others believed he and Tom had crossed paths by accident. Police, meanwhile, worked quietly to piece together a timeline. They learned that Tom Pritchard had been last seen in Oregon around the same time Mark disappeared. A witness from that period even came forward, saying they remembered a scruffy man, matching Tom's description, hitchhiking near Mirror Lake and getting picked up by a blue truck. The vehicle itself was a time capsule of clues. Forensic teams dusted for prints, collected hair and fiber samples, and took soil from inside and around the truck. While some fingerprints matched Mark's and Tom's, there were several that didn't belong to either man. Blood samples on the seat and dashboard were also tested, and to investigators' surprise, they revealed the presence of a third person, someone who, up until then, hadn't been connected to the case at all. The discovery of the truck, instead of closing the case, had blown it wide open. What had once been thought of as a tragic accident or quiet disappearance was now looking much more like something darker, a crime scene waiting to be understood. The investigation into the truck's discovery quickly shifted from simply identifying the body inside to unraveling the mystery of how it got there and what had really happened back in 2013. For detectives, the key was understanding the connection between Mark Hollis, Tom Pritchard, and the unknown third person whose fingerprints and blood were now part of the evidence. Detectives began piecing together what they knew of Tom's past. Tom Pritchard had a long, scattered criminal record, mostly for small thefts, trespassing, and occasional drug possession. He was known to drift from town to town, never staying in one place long. He had been arrested in Oregon months before Mark's disappearance, but had slipped off the radar shortly afterward. What puzzled investigators was why Tom would have been near Mirror Lake at all, a place mostly visited by locals, hikers, and fishermen. As police worked through old case files and sightings, a new witness emerged. Back in 2013, a woman driving through the area near Mirror Lake recalled seeing a blue pickup truck pulled over on the side of the road. She remembered it clearly because she'd seen two men standing outside the truck. One she described as clean-cut, possibly Mark, and another she described as wiry, disheveled, and scruffy, matching Tom's description. This was the first concrete sign that Mark and Tom had crossed paths. The idea began to form that Mark may have picked up Tom while he was hitchhiking, a decision that would soon prove fatal. But the presence of the third set of fingerprints and blood added a troubling new layer. Investigators believed this pointed to an accomplice, someone who had been with Tom that day and who had so far escaped notice. Forensic testing moved slowly, but eventually the fingerprints were entered into national databases. After weeks of waiting, detectives got a hit. Paul Renner, a man with a criminal record spanning multiple states, had been arrested in Texas for burglary just months earlier. His fingerprints matched the unknown set in Mark's truck. When Paul was picked up for questioning, investigators pressed him on the events of October 2013. At first, he denied everything, claiming he didn't know Mark or Tom. But as the evidence piled up, Paul's story began to crack. He eventually confessed that he and Tom had been operating as a pair of petty thieves, robbing isolated hikers and campers near Mirror Lake. They had been desperate for cash, drugs, or anything they could get their hands on. According to Paul, they flagged down Mark Hollis that day, pretending they needed help. Mark, always trusting and good-natured, agreed to give them a ride. Somewhere along the forest road, they pulled a gun, intending only to rob him. But something went wrong. Mark fought back. A struggle broke out, and a shot was fired. Paul claimed Tom panicked, saying they needed to dump the body and hide the truck. Paul fled the state, leaving Tom behind with the problem. Now, 8 years later, it became clear that Mark's disappearance wasn't an accident or a voluntary vanishing. It was the result of a violent encounter that ended in tragedy. And the long-hidden truth was only now coming to light. With Paul Renner's confession, the investigation took a grim turn. Detectives finally understood that Mark Hollis had been the victim of a violent crime, but they were still left with one enormous question. Where was Mark's body? Paul claimed he didn't know. He insisted that after the robbery went wrong, he had fled the scene, leaving Tom to deal with the aftermath. Tom, according to Paul, had driven off in Mark's truck, panicked and unsure of what to do. Investigators retraced Paul's version of events, digging into old reports and searching areas near Mirror Lake once more. Cadaver dogs were brought in, and ground-penetrating radar was used along logging roads and old campgrounds, but nothing was found. Mark's body had vanished as thoroughly as he had all those years ago. For Linda Hollis and her children, the revelation that Mark had been murdered was devastating. But the fact that his remains were still missing left them trapped in another layer of grief. Police believe that after Paul ran, Tom likely tried to cover up the crime. He may have moved Mark's body to an unknown location, ditched it somewhere remote, or even disposed of it in the dense wilderness where it would never be found. In his panic, Tom then drove the truck hundreds of miles away, hiding it deep in the forest. There something happened, perhaps an overdose, an accident, or even guilt driving him to suicide, that left Tom dead behind the wheel, where he would remain undiscovered for years. The case received heavy media coverage once again. Reporters recounted the strange chain of events, the nearly decade-long disappearance, and the eventual shocking discovery of the truck and the third man's involvement. The public followed closely as Paul was charged with armed robbery and felony murder, even though he hadn't pulled the trigger. Under the law, participating in a robbery that results in death meant he could be held responsible for Mark's killing. Linda faced the ordeal of sitting through court hearings and watching the man partially responsible for her husband's death stand trial. She and her children gave victim impact statements describing the agony of waiting 8 years without answers, the pain of not knowing where Mark's body was, and the deep scars the tragedy had left on their family. The judge handed down a long sentence, but for Linda, no amount of prison time could replace what she had lost. As the documentary closes, the camera lingers on the empty Hollis family home, the quiet streets of Pine View, and the overgrown forest, where the truck was found. A small memorial sits on the family's mantel, a photo of Mark in his fishing gear, smiling at the lake he loved so much. His body has never been recovered, and perhaps it never will be. But the truth of what happened on that October day finally came to light, after years of silence. It is a haunting reminder that sometimes the most ordinary moments, a fishing trip, a roadside stop, a small act of kindness, can spiral into a nightmare no one ever sees coming.